example, the mega banks set up the Council on Foreign Relations and other corporate groups to influence peddle and set up vertically integrated pyramidal power structures in every Western country. They lobbied and over time took control of our militaries. And now, totally ruthless mega banks, 6 of them, and the private families that own and control them are establishing absolute domination over this country and the rest of the world. They are funding al-Qaeda rebels openly, now admitting that the West started the whole thing in Libya. It was all staged, an overthrow, unbelievable humanitarian disaster. They are now openly announcing in the last 2 years the solution to the economic crisis they created, that they're admittedly the authors of it, the derivatives fraud, wrecking a once powerful sovereign nation state, the United States, and many other sovereign states, taking us from the greatest creditor to the greatest debtor. They are now openly announcing new private banks of the world. Look what Max has talked about, the EU. They call it Rise of the Fourth Reich, a financial dictatorship. Now we have the super Congress in control of our financial system, not the rest of Congress. Max, is our weakness that some of us have a blind spot, that when real tyranny actually takes over, because it's done in a bureaucratic way and, you know, not some guy in a military outfit strutting around with a beret on, that people can't recognize it because they're going to give us no quarter. They are going to throttle us back into the Stone Age and wreck everything. I don't think people understand that they're not playing games. They're going to totally wreck everything because that's their financial terrorist operation.
Well, I think you can learn a lot from just focusing on prices and how prices represent themselves in the economy and how prices are trending in the economy. So when you ask, why are people acquiescent to this soft stealth coup of the economy? It's because for those same 40 years we just talked about, the prices of stuff like food and energy have been going down. And America was able to outsource its labor to China, which meant that you could buy clothes for prices that were cheaper. The prices of electronics keeps going down. So it's been accomplished by delivering to Americans cheaper prices. They go to Walmart, they buy stuff, and they get a lot, for $1 because it's so cheap because of all this really geopolitical domination that goes on in countries.
But that's in the early phase where the crack dealer goes and gives the 10 and 11-year-olds some free crack. Now we're basically zombie crack whores wandering around with pus coming out of our eyes.
Right. Now prices are starting to go up. So, and this is what's causing the crisis. And, that 10-year government bond chart that now shows getting 2% on a 10-year bond, well, we know that inflation is running 4, 5, 6%. So that means that you're losing money now every single year. So the magic of the post-Reagan revolution is finished, and it's running in reverse, and people's purchasing power is collapsing. And once the price of food, there's a magic formula. Once the price of food gets to be 40% of your weekly budget, you start to see revolutions. It got to that point in Tunis, and we saw a revolution. It got to that point in Egypt, and we saw a revolution. Once it gets to 40% of your budget, the price of food, and it gets to 40%, it tends to create a revolutionary type situations. And in America, the price of food is now creeping up to being a major part of people's weekly spend. Their wages are going down, but the price of food and energy is going up. And this is what's causing this dynamic. So
Max, do 5 more minutes with us because I want to see where this dynamic's leading us. Then your calls, Lou Rockwell, Bob Chapman, and more. All right, your phone calls are coming up in the next 2 segments. Then I've got an interview with Lou Rockwell coming up, former campaign manager Ron Paul, head of the Von Mies Institute, LouRockwell.com, obviously. That's coming up. Then Bob Chapman, and phones will continue to be open with him. A bunch of other news we haven't gotten to. That's coming up as well. More on that hurricane. We're going to break that down. If it turns out like New Orleans and some city gets destroyed, they're coming for the guns. They're not bringing hot blankets. They're coming to your house to take your guns. So let's go back to Max Keiser. So, Max, the system knew this was coming. As soon as they got rid of Glass-Steagall, with similar laws in Europe the last 15 years, they began to set up domestic police state grids. And then 5 years ago, again 3 years ago, the British Ministry of Defense said, we know there's a collapse of society coming. Well, yeah, because the banks that run things engineered this. So clearly they're creating it. Instead of getting in trouble for the Ponzi scheme, they become world rulers. So we just stay tied to them like a bowling ball, taking us to the bottom of the ocean, a 10,000-pound bowling ball. So we're getting to this food ratio situation. So where do you see this going? How do you see this ending?
Well, we're in the end game now because you mentioned Glass-Steagall, and I would also add the Commodity Futures Modernization Act to that. There were ways to increase the debt load. That's what made it possible to increase the debt load to these astronomical levels. But now we've hit debt saturation. And as you point out, it is a Ponzi scheme. And the Ponzi scheme only works to the extent that you have new Ponzis coming in to feed the base of the scheme. But those Ponzis aren't there anymore because people now are taking food stamps. 50 million, I think, are on food stamps in the U.S. And this is not a Ponzi scheme. This is draining the pool of liquidity in ways that make the Ponzi scheme collapse. So it's collapsing in real time. It's just the way I described earlier is that it's collapsing in all over the world in countries at different speeds. And as it falls, when you fall off a cliff, if you hit a branch on the way down, it momentarily blocks you. And then you hit the branch, and then you continue to fall. So as these countries are all falling right now, they're falling at different rates of speed, and they're encountering different problems as they're falling. But they're all falling now. The U.S. dollar is the world reserve currency. It's still holding up relatively to some of these other currencies, however, not against the Swiss franc or not against gold and silver. Gold and silver obviously are becoming the de facto global currency. The only currency people around the world can trust now is gold and silver. And so they're getting rid of all their paper money, and they're going into gold and silver, even though the people who manage those exchanges are raising margin rates continuously, trying to stop people from buying gold and silver. But here's the funny thing about that, is that at some point, all they're doing is they're forcing all the non-leveraged players out of the gold and silver market, which means that the only people left are the people who have 100% paid for the gold and silver, and you have therefore created a de facto global gold standard.
So short term, they're trying to block the general public from getting into gold and silver by raising the margins, hoping it drives it down. But over time, that begins to block their naked shorting that they've also been using to block it. And so it's kicking a lot of speculation out and turning it into a stable currency?
Correct. That's exactly right. They're squeezing out the speculation, which has a momentary sell-offs as the result. But the price is still in an uptrend, and the result is that you've got all cash owners. It becomes a de facto global gold standard.
Incredible. And then they play these games where they'll drive it down $100 in a day, and then it shoots back up 150 the next. And we see that happening today. And people look at 1 month graphs and say, well, it was up and then it was down. Look at a year graph, folks. Look at a 10-year graph. It is scary how much gold's going up, because that signifies they are butchering these currencies worldwide, and all these institutions grabbing their gold. That was my last question, Max, and then I promise we'll let you go. But I want to get your view, because I didn't ask you this, on Hugo Chavez seizing his gold back from England and other reserves around the world. Why is that happening, and where do you see gold going? 2 more minutes with Max Keiser at maxkeiser.com. On the other side, I'm Alex Jones. Lou Rockwell, former Ron Paul campaign manager and chief of staff, going to be joining us to talk about the incredible Time Magazine 5-page spread to convince America Ron Paul can't win. Writer states Paul isn't really running for president, at least not entirely. So they're still running that hoax. It blew up in their face a week and a half ago, but they're back with it again, and they're starting the Rand Paul attack stuff, that they worship Buddhas and maybe reptoids. It's so ridiculous, and they're scared, folks. He is in every poll the closest to beating Obama. In some polls, he beats him. In other polls, he's 1 point behind him. Perry is 3 points behind him. Mitt Romney's 5 to 6 points. That was in Gallup yesterday. In some polls, Ron Paul is #1 in scientific polls. In others, he's #2 or #3. if they gave him proper attention, as Pew Research admitted, he gets the least amount of coverage of any Republican candidate, and it's almost all negative by the so-called mainstream media that only reports on itself. They play this game like we don't exist, when Infowars.com is roughly 3 times the size of MSNBC's website. I mean, these people are legends in their own mind. Fox, to a great extent, dwarfs these guys, but they're legends in their own mind. The alternative media, individual personalities are towering. But in the aggregate, we dwarf them. I mean, it's like the Earth saying it's bigger than Jupiter, when Jupiter's hundreds of times the size of the Earth, or Pluto saying it's bigger than the sun. And I think that's great, though, Max, because I briefly want to get into the question I brought up of Hugo Chavez running off of this gold, University of Texas buying billions in gold, all these other institutions going in and grabbing it and finishing up there. But what do you make of just the hysterical demonization and attacks on Ron Paul while at the same time saying he doesn't exist?
Well, he represents the antidote to having banks run and destroy your country, because clearly he has a grounding in a school of economics that is the complete opposite of the school of economics that has destroyed the U.S. economy. And Lou Rockwell can talk all about that, where the Austrian school of economics favors a return to hard money and real accountability. And so clearly, if you're in the banking business or in the mainstream media business, whether your business is the mainstream media, which is counterfeiting lies all day, or a big bank that counterfeits Federal Reserve notes all day, you're not going to want Ron Paul in office, because he's going to shut you down. So they're going to use their power of their counterfeiting of lies to flood the propaganda outlets, and they're going to use the power of propaganda of counterfeiting Federal Reserve notes to debase the currency, to fund the propaganda and the wars and everything else. So he is the antidote. You know, he's the guy you got to go to now to clean up this mess. And it does surprise me that the mainstream media is scared to death of him.
Don't they run the danger, though? And there's a lot of evidence showing that the hoax is failing. Daily Show put it more succinctly, I think, than we even have, illustrating that they're following a talking point. All the mainline media, liberal, conservative, you name it, even the so-called ABC News type straight-faced stuff, they try to act like they're impartial. They act like he is Von Helsing and they are Count Dracula. I mean, they are hissing at him. And this is just another reminder of just how duplicitous and treacherous and traitorous these people are. But then at another angle, they got Rick Perry coming out and going up in Gallup 10 points in 1 week after saying, I'm like Ron Paul. I say the Federal Reserve might be treasonous or treacherous. And so just the fact that he did that, he turbo-surged into the lead in most of the polls ahead of Ron Paul by acting like Ron Paul. I mean, this really shows that liberty is rising and people are starting to really get it, Max.
Well, that's the risk you take if you are so paranoid about having a legitimate economist in the President of the United States office, that you are going to risk putting up a straw man, a front man like Rick Perry, who's clearly a psychopath. You are endangering the country in ways that you'd have to go to and study that film, The Manchurian Candidate. Remember that film and that novel, which was banned. The Manchurian Candidate was banned in America for years. It starred Frank Sinatra and Angela Lansbury. And they talk about this candidate that was made president of the United States through brainwashing. And this is what a Rick Perry is. He's the Manchurian Candidate from the banking, Bankistan, who's there to represent the interests of the counterfeiters. And that's a real risk when you have somebody who's as mentally depraved and brainwashed as that in the White House. Now, you mentioned Venezuela and Hugo Chavez. He wants his 200 tons of gold back. I look historically back to a very similar incident in the mid-'60s when Charles de Gaulle of France demanded France's gold because for the same reason, that the U.S. was debasing the global currency and using it, the world reserve currency, and abusing it. And shortly after de Gaulle took his gold back from the New York Federal Reserve Bank and put it back into France, gold went from $35 an ounce to $800 an ounce. So if this is the beginning of a similar type move, you're talking about gold making a move from $1,800 an ounce to over $40,000 an ounce, which some are talking about as a possibility if the system gets so cracked and so abused that a monetization of gold by the U.S. or in the Eurozone is necessary to sort this all out. They would have to do so against a basket of $100 trillion worth of fiat money. And to square the circle, you come up with a $35,000, $40,000 an ounce price for gold, which is a possibility.